Hello and happy Friday. We are going to finish up gentrification today. So my goal is to give you a sense of the broader context of what's happening nationwide and not just a narrow look at low-income census tracts, low-income neighborhoods, or those that actually did go forward and experience gentrification. And I do think that larger context is crucial to understand the issues of social class inequality that currently do face the country. I do look forward to reading your reaction papers. Once those are submitted, you are done with these mini reaction papers, and the singular focus of this class becomes pushing your projects forward to ensure that everybody earns the highest grade that they are capable of, and they produce the best possible reaction or research paper that they are capable of. So I'll talk about the overall context of gentrification as I understand it, and then I'll finish up with just a little bit of commentary about the film that I assigned for today. So let's get into it. So gentrification, I've said this, I guess I feel like I've started both of my previous two videos with this point, but it's worth repeating. Over the past couple decades, it seems that gentrification has been easily one of the most intensely debated urban change topics throughout the country. It generates very intense and emotional feelings from people on both sides of the argument. And so sociologists and scholars have been not blind to this, are not blind to what people care about. And so there has been, in addition to popular attention paid to gentrification, there is a decent amount of academic and scholarly attention paid to the issue of gentrification. However, I want to pull back a little bit and conceptualize the multiple ways in which a neighborhood can change. And gentrification, this re-entry of wealth or higher income residents into a formerly low income urban area, that's one of a few ways that a neighborhood change can occur. And I think, as I have said, I think this larger context is absolutely crucial behind gentrification, because how else can we judge its prevalence? How else can we really understand whether or not it's actually something to pay attention to? And if so, where is it actually reaching a crisis, and where is it maybe just a philosophical discussion? Way to think of this, a way to conceptualize my philosophy on this. It's like if I asked you, or you asked me, who won a basketball game, and I tell you, well, the Lakers scored 100 points. That tells you how the Lakers did. It does not tell you whether or not they actually won the game. It does not give you the context behind what those 100 points meant. All right. And so if you ask me about gentrification and I say, okay, Williamsburg, Brooklyn, or Fishtown, Philadelphia experienced gentrification, that's important for understanding the neighborhood, but that's pretty much where it ends. It doesn't tell you a whole lot about where that neighborhood's experience fits into the broader social trends and national trends that are ultimately occurring. All right, so let's take a look at a typology. What I have here is a very simple 2x2 crosstab. This adds some nuance without overly complicating the situation. Among all census tracts, urban, rural, suburban, whatever they happen to be, let's make a distinction between economic expansion and economic decline, because both are clearly possible. So economic expansion would mean that there's wealth coming into that neighborhood. Economic decline would be that there's wealth exiting that neighborhood. And then let's conceptualize expansion and decline. Let's also now control and stratify that based on what is happening to the low-income people within the population, because that's really how we measure gentrification / displacement. It's not so much what are the wealthy people doing, it's what's then happening to the low-income population that previously occupied that neighborhood. So we can have clearly low-income population growth, and we can have low-income population decline. So let's start in the upper left part of this crosstab. If the tract is economically expanding and there is a growing low-income population, that would seem to me to broadly be a situation where the neighborhood is improving and the benefits are dispersed. Now, maybe the benefits go somewhat disproportionately to high-income residents. It strikes me as very likely that that might occur. But it still does place the low-income people in a neighborhood with resources and assets. And that's precisely why segregation is so important. It's because it takes resources and neighborhood assets away from people who would absolutely benefit from accessing them. So that's growth, and that's not so much of a problem. We wouldn't say that that's displacement. If, however, the tract is economically expanding, but the proportion of low-income people is declining, that is gentrification with displacement of the previous low-income residents. Then on the other side is what we don't want to see. I mean, obviously, nobody wants to see a neighborhood experiencing economic decline. However, if the economics of a neighborhood are in decline, but the population is growing, the tract has low-income population growth. So the top right corner of this crosstab, that's what's known as further concentration of poverty. So that's not, nobody's getting displaced there, but you are seeing a concentration of relatively disadvantaged people. Down in the bottom right is what you really don't want to see, just straight abandonment of a decaying urban neighborhood. The tract has fallen into economic decline, and the population itself is declining. So consider the top left here to be what I think a lot of us want to see, and the bottom right to be what absolutely nobody wants to see. But it turns out that low-income concentration and low-income displacement are probably the two most common things that we ultimately see. If we look at this on the map here, I want you to pay very close attention to areas coded in blue. Blue represents generally displacement gentrification, although I would say this huge swath of blue from the Dakotas all the way down to West Texas, that's not really gentrification in the urban sense of the word. That's just displacement. That's an area in which there has been a lot of jobs opening in the oil and natural gas sector, specifically in shale oil extraction. So it's not really urbanization, but we are seeing a displacement of low-income people in generally those rural areas. Same thing here from Kentucky, West Virginia, up into Western Pennsylvania through the Appalachian areas, also commonly due to natural resource extraction. Look at orange. That's kind of blocked by my face here. Oh, no, I'm down here. Orange represents the concentration of poverty. So what we want to look at is cities, because that's the point of this class, and look for orange and red here as it compares to blue, the displacement of low-income people. If we look at the aggregate data here, all census tracts, not just counties, the most common change appears to be the further concentration of poverty. And that's happened way, way more frequently than gentrification has occurred. And that is the crucial context. This is so to go back to my previous analogy, you may tell me that the Lakers scored 100, but if the Celtics scored 125, it doesn't really matter what the Lakers scored. They still lost the game anyway. Okay, so let's take a look at what this means for population. In 2016, and this is charting change, what I'm going to show you is neighborhood change from 2000 to 2016 and 2000 to 2018, because we have full population counts for 2016. We have rates available for 2018. Let's look at the population of neighborhoods that are experiencing strong change. So this does not include neighborhoods that experience no change at all over those 16 to 18 years. Within central cities, over 12 million people live in places that experienced further low-income concentration, right? We added 12 million people to neighborhoods experiencing the concentration of poverty. 1.4 million people live in neighborhoods experiencing abandonment. 5.5 million people live in places experiencing low-income displacement. It's a very small rate out of 327.7 million people in the country. But that's also a lot of people in raw numbers. That is 5.5 million people living in places where they might be prone to low-income displacement. But not all of them are actually prone to displacement, because that might be that people are moving into gentrifying areas and staying because they were the wealthy gentrifiers in the first place. And then, perhaps most troubling to me, only 1.7 million people living in tracts that are growing on all angles, that are clearly connecting people to resources and assets. If we look at the suburbs, that's actually the story here. The story of gentrification is that anybody who has been displaced often ends up in concentrated areas, concentrated poverty neighborhoods in the inner suburbs of a city. This has been very common in Cleveland, very common in Chicago, very common in Boston and New York, where the poverty rates in Westchester County, where I grew up, actually, an inner suburb of New York City, and the inner parts of Nassau County that border Brooklyn in Long Island are experiencing a tremendous amount of growth of the formerly urban low-income population. In the suburbs, 731,000 people living in neighborhoods experiencing abandonment, 3.9 million in those experiencing low-income displacement, and 2.9 million experiencing growth, right? Growth of all angles here. So this is the trend here. The majority of people are living in if you're living in a neighborhood that experienced change, it's much more likely that you're living in a place experiencing concentration of poverty, and it's very troubling to me personally. If we look at a place like Detroit, let's look at a few cities specifically. I've been to Detroit with the Ford Institute 2 years in a row now. Patrick McLean is kind enough to let me tag along and help out with the program that he runs there. And I hear a lot of people talking about gentrification in Detroit. Now, I agree, it might look weird when some middle-class white people move into a neighborhood for a city where the trend has been the exact opposite of that for decades and decades. There are some rosy stories or some scary stories, depending on what you think about gentrification. But what the data demonstrates is it's just not happening in Detroit. You are seeing some college-educated, some middle-class people move back to areas, specifically in the downtown Midtown corridor. But when I look at the map here, I see maybe 1 to 2 instances of displacement in the city. Detroit's issue is still further concentration of poverty. Now, a word on this graph. This is checking the data from, I believe, 2000 to 2018. And the 2-decade, like, we're missing the black box that's the internal part of that period. Because from 2000 to 2010, Detroit lost 25% of the population. 1 out of every 4 people who were living there in 2000 no longer were by 2010. But then from 2010 to 2018, Detroit's only lost a few percentage. It's somewhere between 2 to 5% of the population. So a lot of this abandonment and low-income concentration, I suspect, happened during that period of 2000 to 2010. But nevertheless, the city is still defined by abandonment and economic decline. And let's not lose track of that, because it tells you what Detroit needs. What Detroit needs is not necessarily to protect itself against gentrification right now. What it needs is growth. It needs to encourage growth almost in any way that it can. And please keep in mind, what you're getting here is entirely my opinion on the matter. Your mileage may vary, and I do very much respect that if your opinion does differ, but we want to reach our opinion with a full understanding of what the data is. I only see a couple instances of displacement in the city, and they might actually not even be in the city. I'm looking at, I don't know what this census tract is all the way out here. I can't read the map, but that might even be the inner suburbs of Wayne County. I see one over here. I'm seeing a couple instances of overall growth on the far outskirts of the city. What Detroit needs is to re-centralize, okay? But when gentrification hits, I have said, it hits very, very hard. So if I look at Washington, which is very clearly a city that has experienced dramatic gentrification and displacement associated with that, it's not just a growth of high-income people. What I see within the city is not growing neighborhoods. I'm seeing straight displacement of low-income places. 121 neighborhoods are experiencing, census tracts are experiencing low-income growth, moderate low-income displacement. Pardon me. a little bit of decline far out in PG County, but generally this is starting to even touch the inner suburbs too. So if I look at central DC, I see a tremendous amount of displacement in formerly working class or poor Black areas. And even over in Arlington, it's kind of what happened with what DC's inner suburbs are experiencing is what parts of North Jersey experienced in the late 90s and early 2000s, where all of a sudden Hoboken became, like in New York, became a crazy expensive place to live because, yeah, you live in New Jersey, but you also live a 10-minute train ride into Midtown Manhattan, and that's tremendously attractive to a lot of people. Arlington is becoming the next Hoboken in that regard. And in fact, there's a student in this class writing a paper about gentrification in Arlington, which is unique. It's a very interesting paper about suburban gentrification. So I'm seeing a much different story here. Now, if we look at New York City, which was what was assigned to you in the film, I wanted you to think about New York gentrification. I do see pretty severe displacement in Brooklyn and in Upper Manhattan. Not so much in Lower Manhattan, which was the neighborhood that was being analyzed in this West Chelsea neighborhood. What I saw in that film among the low-income people was not really a lot of displacement. I saw a lot of fear of displacement, which is fair, but I didn't see a lot of displacement actually discussed. And the data does back that up. There hasn't been a lot of low-income displacement and actually not a ton of overarching change in West Chelsea anyway. A little mild displacement over here in the Hell's Kitchen, West Chelsea area. But nevertheless, it seems that the biggest change has occurred in Brooklyn and north of Harlem, I would say, north of Harlem in New York City. However, these are your superstar cities. And I've consistently cited a lot of work by Richard Florida here. One of Richard Florida's major points, and I very much buy it, is if you only look at quote unquote superstar cities, if you only judge urbanism by what's happening in New York, DC, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Chicago, you are going to come away with a pretty skewed understanding of what is happening nationwide. So if I am in charge of New York, I'm ready to say that, yeah, displacement's becoming a bit of a crisis. If I'm in charge of DC, I'm ready to say that displacement is becoming a bit of a crisis. If I'm in charge of perhaps a more representative city, take Charlotte, North Carolina, it's just not a ton of there's just not a ton of displacement happening. Really, I always heard about this in parts of uptown Charlotte. Uptown Charlotte is actually downtown Charlotte, in that it's the central business district, but they call it uptown Charlotte because the central business district is founded on a hill. So if you're going centrally in Charlotte, you're always kind of going moderately uphill, and that's why they call it uptown Charlotte. I see actually no change there, and I see mild displacement occurring in a few neighborhoods. This over here, this really gentrified area, that's Noda, north of Davidson Street, and over here is a neighborhood that I really should have looked up ahead of time. I totally know that neighborhood, but I can't remember what it's called. It's been 5 years since I lived in Charlotte. So anyway, the reason why I say Charlotte might be a more representative case is because Charlotte grew faster over this 2000 to 2020 timeframe than New York did. It added more population. And what we actually saw was further concentration of poverty. We didn't see a lot of low-income displacement. And so if I'm in charge of Charlotte, I'm not really worried about gentrification right here and right now, but I am worried about the fate and the well-being of my low-income populations and the creation of concentrated poverty. We have gone over at length the problems with concentrating poverty and what Wilson caused the change from an institutional ghetto to a jobless ghetto. That's what I want to avoid. That's what I want to alleviate through social policy. Not just complain about gentrification. So if I'm taking stock here, it seems to me that both of these things do present issues. Gentrification does create some issues on the community level, but so does concentration of poverty. And so if you're worried, like, again, as I said on the last time, if you think everything surrounding both gentrification and concentration of poverty is bad, we are paralyzed at that point. So we have to find ways to further integrate communities. That's probably the only way forward. Taking stock of this, 11% of urban residents and 3% of suburban residents live in an area that is experiencing displacement. That's worth talking about, but it's by no means the modal outcome that's occurring. Among the 50 largest cities, about 500,000 people have been displaced. I think we can construct social policy that fixes that drops that number to much lower than 464,000. But that's also a very small portion of the overall population. What I take away from this, the more I read about gentrification, and there is a lot written about it, specifically in cities where it has been pervasive, the more I read about this, the more I start to believe we have to understand why gentrification is occurring. For some, for that real estate broker that you saw in the documentary, urban change, the changing of the West Chelsea neighborhood, that's an expression of choice. Those people had the choice to move into that neighborhood and they exercised it. For others, like the families that were profiled living in the Elliott Chelsea homes, neighborhood change is a result of constraints. They're not able to exercise choice because they're too constrained by their social class status and historical racial disadvantage. Okay, so a couple concluding comments about what I saw in the film. Again, I saw a lot of fear over gentrification, and I didn't see a lot of displacement. Right, the people that were living in Elliott Chelsea at the start of that documentary were still living in it at a later point. And what that shows me is, despite the fear that's associated with neighborhood change, people through institutional and social policy are able to stay in neighborhoods that they have a legitimate historical claim to. And where we see displacement happening the most, it's in areas where you don't have those types of public housing institutions. Like, public housing gets a really bad rap, and I understand why. But here's the paradox that kind of is there. That one of the residents of the Elliott Chelsea home said something very prescient. Is like, if we had all this money, like they're giving us a grant, but we still have to pay $25,000 if we want to go to the Avenue schools. Man, if we had $25,000 in the bank, we wouldn't be living in the projects. But if you had $25,000 in the bank, you wouldn't be living in West Chelsea to begin with, right? So whereas public housing is not necessarily a great place to be living, I saw it preserve those people's place in a neighborhood as it was improving. And there is fear associated with it, and I get where that comes from. But it shows me that urban policy is a workable and realistic thing. It can be operated in such a way to make a place equitable. It's by no means inevitable that displacement must occur as a byproduct of displacement. And so what are people looking for out of that neighborhood? If you live in West Chelsea, like, there are two institutions that were supporting the needs of the population. The Avenue School is an institution, and the Elliott Chelsea Homes is an institution. The people in both of those buildings were relying upon social institutions. So it seems to me what we need is a society that has functional institutions, trustworthy institutions, and cross-class institutions, because that's the third thing that's missing. You had institutions to serve the upper class and institutions to serve the lower class. What is lacking in West Chelsea was an institution that joined those people together for the well-being of the neighborhood. And it seems to me, maybe it's hopelessly naive to think that you can create that, but I saw the building blocks of that in West Chelsea. And when I think about a place like Brooklyn, which has had all this displacement, that inner part of Brooklyn, you had a lot of ethnic and immigrant neighborhoods historically that were occupying that space. And when Brooklyn became an attractive place to live for a lot of gentrifiers, they were able to quickly take over and kind of buy up those those units in a way where the people living in those areas did not have the cohesion. They did not have the neighborhood social capital in order to preserve what the neighborhood was. And as a result, displacement was widespread. So that to me is the comparison, right? Like institutions and social policy can limit this. And in the absence of that, that's where you're going to get large scale displacement, I think, because I did see institutions that served the needs of the population on both sides of this, but I didn't see anything that really connected and brought it ultimately together. So going forward, I think that policy that limits gentrification is probably short-sighted. And I think a very blind belief in the market to sort things out is just going to end with further concentration of poverty. There has to be a third way, and that third way is through functional institutions. Just my take on the matter. I leave it up to you to decide how you ultimately feel about that. So anyway, next week, I'm going to do some odds and ends. I'm going to do some interesting, or I hope some interesting discussions about maybe cities as postmodern environments. I might even do something about urbanization and public health in relation to this virus outbreak that is happening and continues to happen. I'll also be doing some stuff on video next week designed to really help you crystallize what you want your paper, your research paper to do. Now's the time to take stock and to plan about where your paper's going. And I intended to offer a good bit of guidance to students to make sure that you're able to earn the best grade that you are personally capable of. If there's any concern about where you stand, now's the time to reach out to me and to talk that through with me. Have a beautiful weekend. Stay healthy, stay safe, and I miss you guys. Take care of yourselves.